listening to that news conference. What did you make of it?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen, despite your prior segment, that this is a pretty minimal set of outcomes that have been achieved from the trip. This was understood to be the case, though. I don't think Secretary Blinken was going there with the expectation that there were going to be particularly consequential new agreements. This was rather an attempt, as he suggested, to communicate the US positions, including to Xi Jinping directly, which I think is understood to be important, and basically unfreezing contacts between the two sides, which when Xi Jinping referred to the Bali agreements and things, that was supposed to be what the two sides had agreed in Bali when Biden and Xi Jinping met, that then got derailed by the Chinese spy balloon. This was the delayed visit that had taken place afterwards that was then supposed to lead to the two sides essentially transacting on a whole series of the things that Blinken then talked about on fentanyl, on global issues, on Russia, on all of these other questions. So I think there's been progress essentially in going ahead with this unfreezing, but this isn't like a US-China meeting of old where the two sides were really looking to advance a big agenda or cooperate. This is a very, very minimal set of goals that the two sides had.
Yeah, and yet he did meet with China's President Xi Jinping, something that wasn't necessarily on the table. And we've seen the photos, the video footage that's been released by China as well. How significant is that meeting did happen?
Well, when Blinken met with Wang Yi in Munich earlier this year, they had a pretty disastrous meeting, actually, very, very hostile. And I think it could still have been the case on this visit that if it had been an exceptionally tense set of meetings that he'd had with both Wang Yi and Qin Gang, who he met, the other kind of leaders of the Chinese foreign policy establishment, that the meeting with Xi Jinping might not have gone ahead. I think they expected it to go ahead. And it was important because this is a system in which Xi Jinping looms so large over everyone else. It's important to get key messages through to the top leader. So that was a success. And suddenly Xi Jinping has been talking about the United States suppressing, encircling and containing China. He's talked about that publicly only a couple of months ago. So I think the willingness to go ahead under these conditions with a meeting with the US Secretary of State was important in terms of being able to put a bit of a floor under the relationship, prevent the downward slide in relations. So there was real value in that. And I think this was why there was such a concern on the US side to make sure that this trip did actually go ahead in the end.
Yeah, one of the key issues, of course, is the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine and China's stance on it. And Antony Blinken was asked repeatedly whether he was reassured that China won't provide lethal aid to Russia. And he actually spoke about the US concerns about private companies in China that may be providing assistance, which would directly enhance Russia's military capacity in Ukraine. It seemed a little bit opaque, though, as to what progress he may have made in this area. What did you make of it?
Anything that was progress as such, as he suggested, he was asked specifically whether there'd been any new commitments on the Chinese side and seemed to suggest not. I think what we've seen from China in the last, particularly since late last year, has been this increase in the flow of dual-use materials to Russia, that they've basically been bumping up against certain red lines. I think they know not just the United States, but European leaders have made very clear that if they were to go ahead with significant systemic support to Russia of different forms of lethal aid, that this would really lead to significant damage in relations. And so they've held back a bit from crossing that line, but I think there's still real concerns that a number of Chinese companies are providing certain forms of equipment, from drones to bulletproof vests, from semiconductors. Even the Europeans have been talking about sanctioning certain Chinese entities that have been doing that. So no indications of real progress on that. And I think, frankly, that's going to continue from the Chinese side.
OK, Dr. Andrew Small, thank you.